Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our four panelists we have today. We have Ms. Blair Marley, who's a senior manager and also a corporate counsel for a major scientific corporation. We have Melissa Reed, who's the government affairs representative for the North American division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who is the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the general counsel and director of public affairs and religious liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies, good having you here with us and looking forward to our conversation today. You know, we've been starting to see a string of pieces of legislation that have been going around. Some have been couching it in the idea that they are COVID statutes that have been put in place to protect churches. But we're also starting to see that there's at least 36 states that have actually used those same pieces of legislation and somehow are utilizing them as an anti-LGBTQ plus issue from a religious freedom standpoint and a combination of all of these things. What we're starting to see is that as religious liberty advocates try to work, they want to ensure that there is a balance that's taking place where you're protecting religious organizations, but also not getting to a point where that organization is now using their power of religion and their freedom of religion as a sword instead of a shield. South Dakota looks like it's one of the states that has this piece of legislation in place. And what we're trying to figure out is, where do you find the right balance? Gone too far, not far enough, one size doesn't fit all. We're not sure exactly where this is all going. You know, Bettina, tell me what your thoughts are on this and what you see going on and whether there's a good or bad thing happening here, or are we just kind of like worrying about something that is of no real concern?
Well, Orlin, I have absolutely no quarrel at all with the language in this bill that reflects RFRA style, or Religious Freedom Restoration Act style, balancing tests, which balance up the compelling state interest that a government brings to a question with the interest in a religious entity or individual to have their religious freedom respected. This is historically a time-honoured way of sort of balancing these competing interests that you mentioned, Orlin. You know, we go back to 1991, the Supreme Court gutted that time-honoured test. Congress tried to restore it in 1993. The Supreme Court came along and said, no, it only applies to federal actions. States are not bound by RFRA. And so we see these individual state pieces of legislation trying to restore RFRA language. Now, the common myth that has grown up around this language, and which many are trying to further today, is that that religion always wins. But that's not the case. This is a balancing test. A government has to have a compelling state interest. It has to tailor that in a restrictive way to meet that compelling state interest. And so it's a fallacy to say that this always puts a thumb on the scale in favor of religion, because if you look at case law regarding the federal RFRA, it's clear that religion doesn't always win. So to make a long story short, this is to a certain extent sort of a bogeyman that people have put up to say that religious freedom is now going to run amok. I disagree.
You know, Bettina, it's interesting because I think that there's this narrative that's playing out here that says, well, these RFRAs are actually anti-LGBTQ. And so, you know, I was reading about, you know, states they're trying to implement RFRA, and there's a lot of pushback because people say, well, this is going to infringe on the LGBTQ community. And I don't think that there was the same pushback when the federal RFRA legislation came to be, but now things are so polarized that it does look like it's always this either or. So, you know, wanting to protect people's religious liberty, it seems as if another side says, well, no, because that's going to take away something from me. And I see this kind of playing out in this legislation and other legislation that's being proposed like it.
You know, Jennifer, I absolutely agree. The language that is used for the South Carolina legislation that is now law pulled directly from the federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And again, I get, you know, Jennifer mentioned, you know, sort of just where we're seeing this polarization. And it's so, and I agree, and I think, and I'm so troubled by it, because the federal piece of legislation, the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, was signed into law by then President Bill Clinton in 1993. It had bipartisan support. It was passed into law in a nearly unanimous vote of 97-3. Again, mirroring this exact language that we're seeing being castigated as anti-LGBTQ in the South Carolina legislation. A quote from Bill Clinton at that time, he says, what RFRA basically says is that the government should be held to a very high level of proof before it interferes with someone's free exercise of religion. We believe strongly that we can never be too vigilant in this work. And I completely agree with that statement. Again, as Bettina said, this is not a religious freedom take all. This is simply allowing that for those tests, that 2-question test that she mentioned, to take place when we have these conflicts.
Well, Blair, I got to ask you just quickly, and I just want to set the tone here. You're someone where we're now quoting things that you probably weren't even born at the time when this piece of legislation, or what Bill Clinton was thinking. From you're a younger practicing person, some of these nuances are very different. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's, first of all, I think I was like a little toddler. So there you go, credit to that. But but jokes aside, it's hard, right? I'm from a generation that does not want religion at all to interfere with personal beliefs and practices, right? And I do think that we run a slippery slope whenever we kind of find ourselves trying to do a balance between somebody's protected class, right, and religion, which is also protected class. So we're seeing these two classes come to a head to try to figure out who wins. I always take issue, I will say, whenever there seems to be a law or interpretation of a law that can allow us to get to a point where we could find ourselves discriminating against a class and their beliefs. And unfortunately, the states that do have RFRAs are largely conservative states. And so some of their intentions may not be as pure as we would like to believe. Now, do I think that there's a benefit to having RFRA on the books? Absolutely, absolutely. And I would venture to argue against anybody who would say otherwise. But I do think it is important to be mindful of discriminatory practices that can be hidden by the intentions of non-bipartisan support, like Melissa said we had initially.
Melissa, you and I have been in rooms where we've had people from the LGBT plus community across the table from us having conversations. And the one thing that they always seem to push on is that we just think that what you're putting in place is actually an indirect shot at us. And they think that somehow that what we're looking for, what others may be looking for, we are actually targeting them in some way. How do we find this balancing test where we understand that there are those who may not view their lifestyles the way we think a lifestyle should be, but in the same breath, keep our protection and definitely not be using it as a sword in the same way?
Sure. Well, as we know, there's the federal legislation that's been proposed and passed in one body of the Congress, the Equality Act. And one of the major issues and one of the reasons, or one of the key provisions of that piece of legislation, and one of the major reasons that the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which I represent, has opposed it, is because it would completely do away with the federal version of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I have to say I completely agree with Blair, though, as far as, unfortunately, this legislation, whether it's the federal or state level versions, have been misused. And that is the issue to me, is, again, coming from a Christian perspective, I need to be acting in good faith. I don't appreciate the intention of, using this to, treat people with, indignity, or without compassion, or without respect. So, again, you were talking, Orlin, about balancing. So when we worked with several other, meaning the Seventh-day Adventist Church, worked with other faith partners and religious freedom advocates, trying to find a balancing act, we put together, worked and crafted something called the Fairness for All Act, which we have talked about on previous episodes, and we are anticipating will be introduced in this new session of Congress. Again, trying to find that balance, recognizing that we're all coming from different perspectives, recognizing freedom of conscience means also, freedom to not have a religious belief or have a different religious belief, and being respectful of individuals in our treatment of them.
You know what, Jennifer, I gotta say, we keep talking about this balance, but, most of us, spend time learning the practice of law. The practice of law has always been about winners and losers. In the end, isn't this really gonna be a situation where someone's gonna lose when this is all said and done, and somebody's gonna win? I don't even think there is a possibility there can be a really, quote unquote, balance that will take place, or am I missing something? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that that's the false choice here before us, is that there has to be a winner and a loser. And I think, again, when we look back as to what the purpose of RFRA was, it was to protect. It wasn't to allow people to discriminate and to use their protections in a way that harms other people. And I think that, that's Blair really brought up a really good point in that religion, we've done ourselves a disservice in that we've allowed this narrative to exist that says, hey, we're going to use our rights to discriminate against those who don't believe the way that we believe, and our rights are limitless, and anything in the name of religion should be honored. But really, there's supposed to be a balance here. This was originally just so people could practice their faith without infringement and without discrimination. And too many in society look at this as RFRA measures as Christianity in particular wanting to be able to legalize and justify discrimination against others.
Orlin, if I could just point out very quickly, the federal version of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act when it was passed and put into law, it was intended to apply to both federal and state actors. And a Supreme Court decision in 1997 struck down that state jurisdiction and validated that state jurisdiction. And so that's why we're seeing these state versions of this legislation. But again, there was huge bipartisan, almost unanimous support for a version that included both federal and state actors.
Well, it sounds like the American people really kind of know where they want to end up on this. Blair, I'm going to give you the last word on this. As you see this balance that's taking place, even from an intergenerational standpoint, as well as a religious standpoint, a racial standpoint, it seems like all of the elements are there. Where do you see probably being the happy medium when this is all said and done?
Yeah, no, I think it's important to get everybody to the table, to be honest, and to kind of discuss together to figure out where that balance is, and to ensure there's no malintent, and to ensure that all parties can be protected. I will say I don't have the crystal ball, but I do think the best way to avoid consternation and confusion is to bring all the parties to the table, have them chat from religion, from racial background, from gender, from sexual orientation, and kind of figure out where the happy medium is. Can we find a happy medium? And how do we avoid infringing on somebody else's rights?
I think the point that we're all going to be probably arguing about for a long time is, how do you find the right balance? How are you making sure that you're being used as a shield as opposed to a sword? But I think that's a battle we're going to take on for quite some time to go. There's a case out there that's called Apache Stronghold versus the United States. It's an interesting case because it deals with the idea of protecting one's religious beliefs, but it looks at it from what I would call a non-mainstream religion. In Arizona, there's actually this national forest where Native Americans have gone to worship, to pray, and conduct religious ceremonies for an unbelievable amount of time. Recognizing that it's the responsibility of Native people to be protected in some way of themselves, but also the federal government to step in and protect them, the government has usually come in and tried to provide some type of coverage of some sort as it relates to their sacred grounds. However, there's some land that's been transferred, and there's going to be some quote unquote mining that will take place from a copper standpoint that seems to be infringing upon this native land or this native site. And we now find ourselves in the courts, moving ourselves up into the highest levels of the courts to decide how do you find yourself protecting, quote unquote, these Native Americans who may have, quote unquote, a what I would call, regular or contemporary religion. Blair, can you tell us a little bit about this case? Because it looks like we're starting to see a lot of these struggles as it relates to Native Americans.
Absolutely. So we find this case, as you said, starting in Arizona. There is some sacred land for the Apache people, and these people have been on this land and have considered it to be a sacred and spiritual place for centuries, right? And then you see a copper company kind of coming in to request the ability to build through this land, and they come in on a rider of a bill, right? So they weren't even like up to discuss, and then they just kind of hop in there and sneak it in, and it's like, okay, pass. Then they come to try to break through the land and build through it. And there have been protesters, there have been lobbyists, many people who are saying this is wrong, this is terrible. How can we do this? This is against their religion. This is imposing on their religious freedom. And the idea is, well, the copper company needs the land to use it. This is absolutely wrong. And this absolutely goes against the idea that RFRA was meant to protect religious institutions. Religion is not just confined to a church, right? Or to a structure. And so somebody would be horrified if this was happening to a church. If somebody came to a church building and said, or a temple or a synagogue and said, hey, we're going to break this down and we're going to build in the middle of where your church is, thanks. Horrified. But because it's land, people are assuming that it's okay. It's land. It's national land. Incorrect. This is still their spiritual location. This is as much their holy ground as it would be for a church or a mosque or a temple. And that really needs to be taken into consideration. The idea of doing something like that is horrific, honestly.
Blair made two really good points that I want to follow up on. First of all, I think as religious freedom advocates, we have to be really diligent, not only to pay attention to legislation that's kind of this, banner legislation that everybody, knows is dealing with religious freedom issues, but also to pay attention to things like a National Defense Authorization Act, which is how this land swap took place back in fiscal year 2015. So we really have to be diligent about what is happening all the time in Congress, because there can be substantial repercussions. And the second point that I want to bring up that I appreciated that Blair made was just how important it is to protect the rights of minority religious groups. Minority religious groups are particularly vulnerable to government violations of their religious freedom. We see statistic after statistic, and unfortunately, we're seeing it here with this Native American group. It's so important for us as religious freedom activists, as Christians, to actively defend religious liberty for Native Americans, because strengthening their religious liberty strengthens the religious liberty of people for all faith. So that's why I was so glad that the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which I represent, was one of 112, Orlin, 112 religious freedom organizations that signed a letter of support that went to Congress supporting a piece of legislation known as the Save Oak Flat Act.
But I got to ask you, Jennifer, where do we draw the line here? I mean, the government has been using things like eminent domain for centuries. The idea that there should be this other, quote unquote, group that protects a wider number of individuals than simply, maybe the Native Americans here. I mean, how do we end up figuring out when they've gone too far or when it's just simply in the best interest of a community?
I think that's why, laws like RFRA, they're not they're not blanket. There's a balancing, right? So the government has to show that it has a compelling interest and that it's the least restrictive means of furthering that interest. It doesn't say that religion will always win, as Bettina said before, but it does mean that the government does have to think through why they're doing what they're doing. Is this the least restrictive way of doing what they're doing? And is there actually a compelling reason for doing what they're planning on doing? And in this case, I think, at least the facts as I see them, I don't think that the government has a strong case here. Again, as Blair said, if this was a church or a mainstream religion that was being impacted, I don't think it would have gotten to this point where it had to be heard by the full Ninth Circuit to determine whether or not the Apache should be able to keep their land and their sacred site. But because this is a minority religion, because this is not a Christian group, I think that this is really where RFRA, where it comes into play, and why we need to let people know about the importance of RFRA and laws like RFRA, because this is to protect those minority religions, these vulnerable religions that people might not know about and might not otherwise advocate for.
Yeah, I mean, what Jennifer is saying is so true. As I was reading through the court documents related to this case, I kept thinking, what if it was the DC government proposing a metro line that went right through the National Cathedral? I mean, we understand intuitively that that's a desecration. I mean, that is clearly government overreach. But it's less intuitive when we start dealing with religions that we're not familiar with. I know my home country, Australia, has dealt with many of these instances relating to Indigenous Australian sacred practices and sacred land. And let me tell you, I would say 95% of the time the courts have got it wrong. And it's only very recently that they have sort of begun to take a more holistic understanding of what constitutes religious practice. So it is, when you also take a step back, it's a case of applying Western law to something that is not inherently Western as well. So you have all these sort of cultural clashes that are coming through. But as everyone has been saying, it really comes down to this balancing test. The government is compelled to restrain its burdening of religion unless it has a compelling state interest and is narrowly tailoring that to achieve that purpose. But first of all, the first thing is that we have to actually recognize it as a religious practice. And that's why I'm so heartened that in this case, it seems that mainstream religions are really rallying around this case. They're seeing it as a principled issue that they must support in order to, to maintain a consistent and coherent understanding of religious freedom.
Well, when we talk about minority religions, though, and Melissa, you might be able to weigh in on this, how is a government supposed to be in a position where it is aware of every particular minority religion that may be out there, where you could end up stepping on the toes of something just simply because you're not familiar with every aspect of every minority religion? How do we end up giving the government a right to do its job as well, Melissa?
Well, I think that that's an unrealistic expectation, is that we are all, and particularly as we're seeing new religions or alleged religions popping up all over the space. That said, I don't believe that this is an issue of not being aware of the ground being sacred for the individuals. If the site did not sit directly on top of a low-grade copper deposit, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? We're looking at, we've been talking about balancing acts, and we've talking about competing interests, competing protected classes. Right now, we're looking at which is more important, to honor the sacred land of a minority population, a minority faith tradition, or national economic interest. And I think, I think that is the issue. And again, I'm so glad to see so many, a diversity and a plurality of religious freedom organizations standing up for the rights of this group. And, we know in March of 2023, that we'll be hearing oral arguments for that Court of Appeals rehearing of that case. And so I'm hoping that that they will be ruling in favor of Apache Stronghold.
So, Blair, you're telling me that in a capitalist society, we're generally trying to make as much money as I can, that I'm actually going to be trying to figure out a way to let a minority religious group continue to engage in a practice, and I, in my capitalist point of view, need to take a second chair on that. Is that what we're saying here?
It is, and I will say I am a capitalist too, and happy to be one most of the time. But there are times where I'm ashamed of it, and days like today are one of those days where we are finding ourselves trying to compare the rights of someone's religious convictions to our desire to make money, and that's just wrong. I don't think it's just wrong from a human perspective, but I think it's wrong from a Christian perspective as well. And I don't think it's impossible to say that Christ would want us to look at this in a way where we protect the minority here. I think as Christians, we know specifically that Christ did a lot of work protecting the minorities, the outcasts, and those who were not considered to be the popular people of his day. And he went above and beyond to do that. I think it's our calling as Christians in this setting to do just that as well. And I'm very pleased to hear about what the Seventh-day Adventist Church is doing to that front with Melissa and her group.
So, Melissa, if I had to have you handicap this, where do you think this ends up?
Oh, Orlin, I'm not sure. I would be confident, unfortunately, if this was a quote unquote mainstream religion. I'm less confident. But God is faithful, and I will be optimistic, cautiously optimistic that the court will rule, the Ninth Circuit will rule in favor of Apache Stronghold.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what the final decision of this is going to be. We're going to have this really butting of heads between capitalism and religion, and we'll see exactly who ends up on top when this is all said and done. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, Orlin, according to the Beckett Religious Freedom Index of 2022, Americans are very protective of religious minorities. In fact, 89% of Americans support protecting Native American sacred sites on federal land. I find that encouraging.
Wow, Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
I apologize in advance for the randomness of this, but did you know South Dakota, which we were discussing just earlier, did you know that it doesn't just have a state flower or a state animal, it actually has a state soil? It has a state soil called the Hydeck soil, which helps grow the prairie grass in South Dakota. Sorry, I just couldn't get past that. You heard it here first.
I definitely didn't know that. Blair, tell me something I don't know.
Absolutely. The last state to pass a state RFRA Act was Indiana in 2015, and we have not seen any states that are showing as being more moderate and less conservative looking to do that since California has done that.
Wow. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. So as we just were talking about representing those with less known faith traditions and views, it's interesting that even though the number of people in the U.S. identifying as Christian continues to drop and is now at about 63%, members of Congress who identify as Christian continue to make up the vast majority at 88%. So it's important to make sure that these people who are held accountable to protect all people of faith, not just Christians.
Wow, interesting topics there. Well, ladies, thanks a lot. This has been a lot of fun. You brought a whole bunch of knowledge to me I had no idea it even existed, so thanks a lot. Thanks again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.